Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been a really spectacular occasion, people falling off the galleries, and we're delighted that you're here right to the end because this panel is going to be something quite spectacular, I'm sure. My name is Homi Bhabha, and I teach in the English department and direct the Humanities Center. And this panel, Reception and Use, is, as you can imagine, one of enormous importance, particularly loving books in the digital age and being, the way in which books become part of our affective lives. And I think this conference has done much to show that much of what we gain in the digital age supplements what we had and knew and loved in the age of paper. Our panelists this afternoon are Paul Duguid, adjunct professor at the University of California at the Berkeley School of Information, and Elizabeth Long, department chair and professor of sociology at Rice University. Thank you both very much for being here this afternoon. Professor Duguid's research focuses on the early history of trademarks. He has co-authored a book with John C.D. Brown called The Social Life of Information, and the title of his paper here is The World According to grep, Search in Context. Professor Long, may I introduce both?
Sorry. Yes.
Professor Long has written widely about books, the book industry, and readership in relation to the social world. Her most recent book is Book Clubs, Women and the Uses of Reading in Everyday Life. Do catch the Freudian echo. Her current research involves the uses of literature with the environmental movement. The title of her paper this afternoon is Loving Books in the Digital Age. The mystery becomes even richer. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentations. I would be very grateful if you could submit your questions on index cards, which will be collected and turned over to me. Unfortunately, we may not be able to get through all the cards and all the questions, but I promise you I will make a judicious and provocative selection. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I, like the others before me, would very much like to thank Dean Gross and Leah for the invitation here. I must say that when I look at the list of people who have been speaking today, people from whom I've learned an immense amount, not only today but in the past, my first reaction on looking at the program was not so much to ask the question, why books, but more to ask the question that some of you may have been asking is, why me? It's a daunting task to take on rather late in the day after these people have been before me, and hence I tried to produce the most uninterpretable headline I could for my talk. Let me, because I'm a disastrous manager of time, try to begin by just answering the question, why books? And then, if there's any time left, I will get to what I intended to say and maybe tell you what grep is. I'm a little worried now with have computer scientists in the room that I may not say what it is well enough. Let me say, why books? I think there are some simple and maybe seemingly banal answers, but they're important ones. I think we have to look beyond a simple assumption that they're just conveyors of information or communication. And we have to think in some ways of them as part of the construction of what we think of as information. And that's a tricky notion. It's very odd to think how hard it is to produce the phrase making information. Making up, perhaps, but making somehow we've persuaded ourselves it's a kind of naturally occurring object. And I want to say it probably isn't. And the second thing I think that's important to understand about books is that they're terribly important not simply to conveying information or their content or the text, but telling us something about what these things mean and why they matter. So fitting them into a social context for interpretation. Information is a very kind of lame object, I think, which is extraordinarily hard in the abstract to try to understand what it might be. An example, I think, that takes us back really to the very beginning of what we think of as perhaps the canon, our very first epic, is, sorry, we've gone too fast, is the beginning of Gilgamesh. Which begins, he came a far road where he found peace and set all his labors on tablets of stone. And already not only are they inscribed, and they're inscribed in some kind of durable object, but then when we get to the poem itself, and not to Gilgamesh's first telling, we discover it's now a tablet in a box of cedar. It has a clasp of bronze, and is written on lapis lazuli. And that re-inscription tells us again something about the evaluation of the poem. And I look on this verse in some way as perhaps our first piece of metadata as well. Here we are in some way giving us an account of what the physical manifestation of the book is. If it's going back to Gilgamesh seems to be taking us back far too far, what I want to say is that looking back, I think, is important not for a dreadful nostalgia. Those people who simply cannot let go of the book and will tell you about its feel and its touch and its smell, all of which must be respected. I think it's partly that as we want to look forward, if we want better reading devices than the iPad, if we want better reading devices than the iTouch or the Kindle, we have to understand, I think, the book a little better. And that understanding comes into competition through two, I think, conflicting narratives that we have about information. And you'll have to excuse me, I come from a school of information, so I'm going to use this term information as if I know what it means. Once you become a professor of information, you kind of bogus authority that you carry out into the world. The only one worse I know is that the business school has a professor of knowledge, and that's a really rum job. So excuse me if I just throw this term around in a way. But I in part because of the way the term is used today. So in this competing narrative, I think there are two notions. One is Stuart Brand's famous vacuous aphorism, information wants to be free. Now, it gives us two problematic ideas. One is that information has wants, and the other is it's capable of freedom. But if we leave both of those things aside, I think it does come up against a very important narrative that we face. One is captured in terms like, for the iPhone, the notion of jailbreaking, that these things have been illicitly captured, and we should now release them. And that's part of a larger narrative about going open. We have open source software. We have open programs like Wikipedia. And within that, there's a notion of emancipation, that to argue against those things, to argue against what Adrian Johns talked about this morning is the libertarian streak within the digital world, is some way to take us back to, well, why shouldn't I be talking about it? Old England and the king and captivation and all those dreadful monarchic kind of things. So the dreadful wish to step backwards. But on the other hand, I think there is a conflicting narrative against the idea that we should simply strip the chains off books, and that's the one that actually information needs to be constrained. And though we don't actually say it like that, in the notion of overload, which people will talk about all the time, in the idea of the flood of information, that information is just overwhelming us indeed, if I may put in a little ad, Anne Blair's new book. Everybody should read it. This idea has been with us for a long time. So on the one hand, there is an argument saying, well, we just need to continue this great path of emancipation. There's something pushing back and saying, hang on, we need to think a little about constraints. That, in fact, came up intriguingly in, of all places, Wired. There we have the voice of liberation suddenly saying, under the guise of the editor, actually the web is dead. What we're going to now are these confining apps which are going to restrict and constrain. Now, I actually don't believe him for a minute, but I think it's an important sign that as we start to feel overburdened, we start to say, no, let's go back to a little corralled world. So that's why books, I think, because we want to understand that world both of liberation and constraint. I'm going to try to talk about it in a way by the via negativa. I'm trying to go to argue, well, who puts the alternative case? Who in many ways puts the liberation case before I try to make a case that we actually need to think about constraint as well? The first two people I'm going to bring up, well, one is grep, and grep I'm just going to use as a kind of symbol. It's a term of search, which I'll explain in a moment, that what we really want is just a mass of information across which we can search at will. And the masters of that, of course, are Google, so why not hold them up here? And they're going to make a case that what they have real problem understanding is the relationship between constraints and resources. And there is a deep engineering tendency to see constraints and resources as two wholly distinct categories. If I get there, I shall say how this comes up to us so often in an evolutionary argument, that this way of openness is the way the technology is evolving, and actually there's nothing we can do about it if you read somebody like Kevin Kelly, and I don't advise you to read Kevin Kelly, but that this is just inexorable and this is the future. I shall talk a little about movements across history in which this tone of going open, we must go open, the future is simply to open everything up and remove all the old constraints of the ancien regime. Finally, to say, but I think what we're doing is much more going round in circles. Grep. Grep, in fact, this is actually an account of the birth of grep. Grep is basically the Unix search technology. It allows you to search for a string of characters. It's how you all now have search on your computer. It can choose any particular string, whether it includes spaces, whether it's the beginning or the end of sentences, how you choose to configure it, you can find it. The text becomes marvelously flat. Now, for those of us who are old enough to have had to write a thesis using a concordance, let me tell you, this is wonderful. So I'm not complaining about the nature of search. I only think that we maybe stretch it a little too far. In the engineering view, I think important things to note are that the great fathers, or really the father, not Warren Weaver was a kind of snake oil salesman, but Claude Shannon, when he describes information, he makes it absolutely clear that the semantic nature of aspects of communication are irrelevant to the engineering aspects. And I think that's enormously important to understand and also enormously problematic. At times we can claim that meaning is absolutely irrelevant to what we're doing as engineers. At other times we can say, no, we're talking about it. And I think as we got this flat world that I'm suggesting, we moved actually through what was in our lifetime a very significant break, a break in which search was a search through ordered systems, which goes right back to the sort of libraries in which one found Gilgamesh, back to Ebla and places like that. You had a system of order and you searched within that. And in fact, systems that some of us at least will have used, the Wide Area Information System or Veronica for search, Yahoo, which of course is an acronym for yet another hierarchical officious order, all assumed a notion of order. And Yahoo used to hire librarians, and they would produce categories, if you remember, of Yahoo of the old days. But along comes Google and Web 2.0, and now in many ways, order is a purely emergent category. We have a natural resource. We go from the stacks, in some sense, just to this huge bunch of books, and within that, the text that we rip out, and now we can search across it. And so when they say that their mission is organizing the world's information, it's a very different notion of organizing, I think, than we have had from the other systems. And one of the people I think who have taken that up in many ways are Google. And I want to talk just a little about Google Books. And because I'm in California and close to Mountain View, Parnassus as I like to think of it, I have sort of various run-ins with the people from Google. Now, the first thing I should say, I work in 19th century trademarks of late, and I've been working on medical medicines that were trademarked in the 1870s. And if you want to discover what people said about them in the 1870s, Google Books is absolutely fabulous. So don't let me be heard to say I don't like Google Books. I just don't like something about Google Books. I think one of the intriguing things for me was back in 2004 when what I shall call a particularly high officer at Google said to me, Google is going to start scanning books. And I and a colleague said to him, well, which ones are they going to scan? And he said, oh, we're going to scan all of them. Intriguing in many ways in what it revealed. One, I would say, is just startling naivety. And Google itself is pulling back from the idea that it would scan all of them. In fact, has pulled back long ago and has been astounded at the expense, I think. But the idea that, for instance, any idea of selecting among books should just be washed away is extraordinary. I actually talked to someone, again, at a library, which I cannot name, which was one of the first 5 working with Google. And they said when Google came in, they said to them, well, here are the books, would you like the metadata? And the people from Google said, what's metadata? When it was explained to them, they said no. They eventually came back and actually said, oh, by the way, you know that stuff you were talking about? You wouldn't mind sending it to us, would you? But I think it was, the idea that of Dan Clancy quoted here is that libraries, well, that's where the information was. And what libraries are is a storehouse of information, and that books are artificial impediments that prevent us from getting it. These are, I dare say, quotations. But along with a kind of odd demonization of the book, there's also a kind of idealization of the book as an enormously stable, simple, easily interpreted artifact. Dan Clancy, who I just mentioned, has actually left as the head of Google Books, gone to YouTube. I was with one of his lieutenants at the American Historical Conference not long ago, and I had to debate him in awkward circumstances. But what was intriguing was that he said, look, you historians, you're our power users, we understand you, and I read books too. In fact, I was reading a book on the plane coming down. There was a sort of quiet nodding, and he held up the book. And as somebody in the room said at the time, you could hear eyeballs rolling. It was an extraordinary innocence that would be what would impress historians about your understanding of the book. But it's an idea that books are these very simple and straightforward objects that we can now simply take on and tear the text out of. So we get an idea of what I call shucking information. That is what we do. We just pull the sides off and the information comes out. Now, this is a long argument. Let's not pin this on Google. It actually came up in this article in Slate just about a week ago that basically any work of literature is impervious to the constraints of its physical medium. Yeah, well, you kind of nod and you say, really, can you? But people still do believe that. Bill Mitchell, early on from down the road at MIT, early on in the digital age, had this wonderful condescending phrase in City of Bits, that books are left for people addicted to tree flakes encased in dead cow. Those of you, of course, who still read leather-bound books, particularly with wood pulp paper inside, are a small community here, but that's you. But it has a long history that books are simply containers of information, and so I threw in this little bit of Pliny to justify that expensive education that I had. Pliny is not only fascinated by the 20,000 facts, and he loves each chapter. He tells you how many facts he got into that chapter, and he used to keep them down on a little codex, actually. Not only that, but also he has this nice quotation from his chum, Demetrius Piso, who says, and it depends on the translation, perhaps it means a reference book. Perhaps, in fact, we should talk to Leah and Anne about this when he says thesaurus. But the other translation, which you find in some editions, is just warehouse. That's the original meaning of this. And this is just a warehouse of facts. We don't need books. All we need is just to stack up the facts. And in fact, Paul Ockley, who was mentioned earlier today, has this nice idea that you can really just pull the information and leave not only the sort of material of the book behind, but also the rhetoric that goes with it. All that stuff is on. So let me try and say what I think we can sort of put as a theoretical problem here, and that is that there's a simple, and I worked for a long time in Silicon Valley around engineers, there's a simple assumption, I think, that is often prevalent, and that is that there are constraints on the resources. And what you do in an engineering challenge is you remove the constraints and let the resources, as it were, do their powerful work. The problem with that view is that we as people are enormously perverse. Engineers often think that, I think. And the point is that we often turn constraints into resources for us. And the physical material of a book may indeed be a constraint in many ways. It's dusty, it's heavy, it gets in the way, it crowds up the room. But we've also turned it into a resource for interpretation, and pulling them apart is a challenge. This text up there is actually a proposal by Samuel Colt, partly in partnership with Morse in 1844, I think it was, to get a concession in New York for the telegraph, which was going to replace the newspaper. And for 160 years, there has been this assumption that within the next decade, we would replace the newspaper. But pulling the paper out of the news has proved an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And even if we think we're there today, many of its quasi-replacements still use the form and impute the physical and material form in many ways as they put it into a digital account. So that's kind of at the back of my argument. Let me race on. So what comes if you don't understand, in some ways, the complexities of the book, the way we use both its materiality, its structure, and its form? Well, one thing that I've chased now, actually, since Google Books went online, its inability to deal with multiple volume works, because it didn't know they existed. And in fact, and I think I can take some credit for this. They've worked to try to change it because I've bitched about it for years. I looked at the first page of the search for Tristram Shandy 5 years ago when it was just in prototype, and I looked this week before I came, and it's still dreadful. That is, you start off with, I think, a volume 2. It doesn't tell you a volume in a set of how many. It doesn't tell you how to get to volume 1. It doesn't tell you how to get to succeeding volumes. You come down, I think, to a complete one. Then you come down to one that begins with a volume 1. You have no idea how these books relate to each other or how they relate to others in the set. Now, they will tell you, and librarians will tell you when they want to cover for Google, that this is a very difficult problem. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. If you look at something like Gallica, the French library, for all its problems, it can handle multiple volumes without it. There are problems with volumes, but not this. Again, if we overlook structure, we run our algorithms across books, and we assume that there are things that look like tables of contents, and so we put them as a table of contents. They're off on the list of illustrations. We assume that if we find the index, and then we put a link to the number after the index, it'll find a page. But of course, if you do that in law books, they're actually indexing the cases rather than the pages. Or if you do it in a multi-volume work, they'll tell you which volume in which you will find that page, etc., etc. They're minor complexities, or they're indeed social structures that we have to deal with. Is that? No. An intriguing thing for me is this is Knut Hamsun's Pan. It's the edition that's available first if you go to Google. In fact, I think the only fully readable edition. What they didn't know was that, of course, it was a massively censored edition. So here is a book about a sexual neurotic which has had all the sex taken out of it, at which point it becomes hard to see that he's neurotic in many ways. But that, and indeed, what I object to more than anything about Google Books is not that scholars like the people in this room can't deal with problems like this, but that they have sucked out from oblivion some of the very worst editions in the world. And with a kind of romanticization of the 19th century, and knowing that gets them out of the copyright hole, they've chucked all this junk on the web, and some of these things are things that librarians very carefully, and editors over time, had removed from the hands of naive and unsuspecting readers and put into distant repositories, so that if you actually went and found it, you'd done a lot of work to get there. Now they're the first thing to come across. And what's happened is these are now being put in different kinds of wrappers and are circulating on Kindle and circulating from Amazon as 99-cent books, some of the most splendidly corrupt editions you'll ever find. Or there's interesting, one of the things that's come in is going to rescue Google in a way is the Hattie Trust. Ho, ho, some rescue. This was actually something I came upon last week, which I liked in particular. As you leafed through the book, you would get a page, and then you would get something which said, this page is missing from the particular edition. Then you get a page which has a very nice idea of a book that has its verso pages, but not its recto pages. Now, I don't mean that the recto is blank. I actually mean that the verso is there, but somehow when you get to the other side, there's just space. Let me go on. I'm being slow. What I think we miss in particular with this naive interpretation of the book, of not understanding its many, many different forms, which we've heard about today in much more sophisticated discussions, is the way in which, if we want to communicate new ideas, we push at the form of the book. We experiment with it. So, for instance, I like Kindle saying to you about Coetzee's new book, The Diary of a Bad Year, I'd like to read this book on a Kindle. Well, I bet you would, but I bet Coetzee wouldn't like you to, because, in fact, he made a particular effort to structure the page. The page for him is a semantic object. There are 3 narratives. on each page. If we say, well, let's blow up the page to large print, or let's turn it sideways, and we destroy that, the whole book, in many ways, loses its essence and its meaning. And this, I think, is not due to courtesy only. People are pushing at the physical boundaries of the book. So the assumptions are, I think, that information wants to be free, and that the freedom will come through technology, and that that's going to get us out of this problem, even if we somehow don't quite understand the physical form of the old technology. Somehow new technology will escape those problems. I think of it as a neo-Darwinian view. That is, many people just see, as I said, technology evolving. Nicholas Carr, whose book was mentioned today, I think thinks very much in that way. Kevin Kelly, as I've said. Frederick Kilgore, who the librarians here will probably know, the father of OCLC, very much had this idea in his history, the evolution of the book, that what we're simply seeing is an evolution of ever more efficient communicative systems. And so he has an idea of punctuated evolution, and these are the main things that first we get clay tablets, then we get the paper roll, and then we get the codex, and then we get print, etc. Let me just take one of those, the codex, and in rather ham-handed form just say how bad that evolutionary argument is that we're just moving ever forward actually looks. Now, this history is a particularly inept history, and I suspect that many of my dates may even be off by a century. If they're off by a millennium, I'm probably in trouble, but if not. But basically, if we ask in all the main communities where these different forms turned up, it's an intriguing pattern. We know that paper appeared first in China and comes very, very late to Western Europe, even though Kilgore wants to put us at the top of the... There's an intriguing battle over the codex notebook. This is not before it's used as a book, as we think of it now, but for taking notes. And although the Christian communities probably got it from Jewish communities, it kind of created a barrier between the two. The Jewish communities in general said that sacred texts should not appear in the codex. Therefore, when we look at translations of the Old Testament and they talk about a book, it's actually quite tricky to know what they mean and whether this is a Christian interpretation or a Jewish interpretation. But if we look at the codex book, we'll discover that the Chinese, who had paper very early, really never bothered to get to the codex. They used the sutra binding, which they got from India. They used the butterfly binding. The codex really didn't get to Korea until the 20th century. Though the codex, really the Christians and the Christian communities of Western Europe are the very first to use the codex. So then we turn to printing, and we suddenly discover that things look very different again. The Chinese, as we know, and as they were very pleased to show us at the beginning of the Olympics, had printing long before Gutenberg. And indeed, whereas other places like India, which had spread the sutra fold for binding books, didn't in fact have printing until remarkably late. Not because they're naive or foolish or don't want information. They just had different other ways to access it. And finally, if we look at typography, we see again that it's the Chinese who get there first, the Koreans who get there very soon afterwards with an alphabet. Gutenberg is actually rather late into this grand mix of things. So if you look at this, what I'm trying to say, try and look for an evolutionary single pattern across that. Just look at the red names. And is there a single line that is unfolding there? Can we tell this story in ways of evolution? Okay, I should be quick. So in that context, that perhaps things are not moving in a single linear way, well, how does the closed versus open source argument hold up? The idea is enormously attractive, and it's very hard to argue against open source. It's given us so much in many ways, and I don't advise you to argue against Wikipedia because your email crashes for many days afterwards. But there are cautions about whether the software analogy moves into a different world. But what I want to say at base is this argument that it's time to go open has enormously deep roots. The wife of Bath, I think, is the first person who really wants to say, the great feminist, I'm throwing off book-bound authority. It's experience in the world. She sounds like Mrs. Jimmy Wales to me. But she's saying, look, out in the world, we can tell you what goes on. Nullus in verba, the Royal Society's motto. We're not going to be bound by books, by words, by what people have said before. And as Spratt says, we're going to do it by going out and just looking at the world. Experience. It's going to be available to every single person. Intriguingly, it's something that moved through the field of medicine. In the French Revolution, the idea, understandable, that the old royal societies were corrupt and that really anybody should be able to become a doctor, seems strange to us now, but it swept through New England in the 19th century. I'm not actually sure when it came to New Hampshire, but I know Connecticut in the 1840s disbanded its medical societies under the Thomsonian influence and said basically anybody should be a doctor. It's remarkable in many ways. It happened in law. We talked today about law reports. The law reports in England were disbanded, and anybody should be able to produce a law report. We want to overthrow authority. It's all very well, but I think that behind it there is a tricky challenge. It's a challenge that goes all the way back to the charmides. It's the point, in fact, about medicine when Socrates says, look, more or less, how do you know whether you can trust the advice of a doctor? It's the point at which I should say, why on earth do you believe any word I say? The question is, he says, look, if you know his advice is any good, you're probably a doctor yourself, and therefore you don't need his advice. But if you need his advice, you're not in a position to assess it. And of course, what we have in order to get over the charmides problem, which I think is a very profound problem, is a series of different kind of institutional and material constructs, the university being one of them, of course. We talk so often, too often, about the university as a brand, but indeed, in many ways, it is. So what we have in many ways is a series of relations between of objects, both material and institutional, that carry with them a certain level of how we assess authority, and we have to be careful about shucking that off. We've enclosed it in many ways. We go open, but we also go closed. The round nature of the library is symbolic in many ways. We circle back in notions like the encyclopedia, which of course is enclosing knowledge that is useful and excluding knowledge that is not. Search itself is this notion, etymologically, of cycling round, as indeed is research. If we look at something like the Philosophical Transactions, we see it went open very early on, would have articles on almost anything. Before too long, it's changed, and we can see all those authoritative names and their credentials coming with them to know what to stand. And indeed, I think today we start to look not only at the idea of the app and Wired telling us that we're going closed again, Google with its attempt at Knoll to replace Wikipedia, the Hattie Trust, the app, and indeed Facebook is surely a new enclosure. It's AOL reborn. Perhaps I shouldn't say that at Harvard. So my conclusion in one is simply that in these occasions, as part of this authority structure, material matters, and we forget that at our peril. Thank you.
I, too, want to thank Anne and Leah for organizing a fantastic conference, and everyone at the Radcliffe Institute for all the work that they put into it, and all of you for coming. It's been a really amazing day. The speakers have been very hard to follow. And so I would like to say at the beginning that this is a rather simple paper and pretty literal. When I was asked to come to this conference, the reason I was asked is because I look at readers. So what I've written is a small paper about readers. And I think they're interesting to look at because whenever these kinds of technological changes sweep into a field of cultural production, there is a lot of chaos and perturbation, and the chaos tends to divide into prophets of gloom and prophets of light. So that on the one hand, you have people terribly worried about the old realm under threat, in this case, the world of books and reading. And on the other hand, you have sort of early adapters and people invested in the new technology often, portraying these utopian prospects of beautiful people walking into the light of a better day, brought to you, in this case, by digitization. Today, interestingly enough, we haven't had too much of that bifurcation, which I think has made the discussion much more interesting. People invested in the world of print books, by the way, have been preparing for some of this discussion for quite some time. Prophets of both tendencies have been talking about the end of the book at least since the beginning of the electronic media. So they've had a little time to kind of get used to the thought that there might be a change in media ecology, whether that might be good or bad for the book. Secondly, I think we all have before us the example of music. With the rapid obsolescence of a variety of platforms and perhaps even the extirpation of the audience's ability to listen to long works or assemblages of related pieces of music that we heretofore called albums. So there people are genuinely worried about that development. Turning to readers, I think, offers an interesting middle way and perhaps a more empirical one to enter this discussion, in that although readers' own perceptions of cultural developments are somewhat conditioned by the critics' conversation, they're also engaging with these new and old technologies of reading for pragmatic purposes and are well suited to produce a nuanced view of what is better or worse or simply different about printed books and newer ways of reading across a rather broad spectrum of usages. So here I'm going to talk about what readers have to say about loving books or reading in the digital age, first in terms of the book or digital reading device as a material object with a variety of functions. We've been introduced to that ever since we heard about the volume under the buttocks of the short reverend at the beginning of of the day. And next in terms of the reading practices in which people engage their books and or Kindles, Nooks, or iPads. So a couple of caveats. This analysis is based on interviews, and not very systematic ones, with 4 book clubs, a few librarians, and various readers that I approached opportunistically, as well as an email conversation with the SHARP, that's the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading and Publishing, listserv and the references they gave me. Most of the people interviewed are habitual, if not professional, readers of books. Most are over 40. Quite a few are over 65. Although they've told me about younger relatives and friends, I need more information from people under 25, especially from young people who don't necessarily tend to read printed books, in order to generate a more balanced picture of this development. Second caveat, as anyone who's been here since the morning knows, many very smart people have been thinking about this for a long time. I've just entered the conversation, so please forgive me any gaffes of the newcomer. Okay, so first I want to talk about books and Kindles, and I guess I'll use Kindles as the substitute for e-readers, because most people I know have Kindles, they don't have iPads yet. When readers start to talk about their love of books in opposition to e-reading devices, the first words that often come to them are lyrical descriptions of the sensuous pleasures of handling a book. People talk about the feel of the pages, the smell of fresh paper, the visual pleasure of seeing a book's jacket or its cover. The tone is one of really pleasurable sensory immersion. And in fact, I can remember that was one of the first ways my son, who actually doesn't like reading, dealt with books. He would just sort of plunge his nose into the middle of the book and in total delight. Sometimes this aura extends out from individual books to descriptions of the places where books are found. The smell of bookstores, or the Post-it notes from staff members of bookstores about their favorites. The beckoning corridors of books in a good library, and the sort of prospects of infinite knowledge that retreat from you as you walk down those corridors. These sensuous pleasures can be compromised if the books in question are made with junk paper, and sometimes the people who take this line actually avoid paperback books. There's a manufacturing niche that's developing here. At least 2 paper manufacturers are entering the discussion by touting the importance of permanent, high-quality paper. Google Permanence Matters is one fascinating website that you read all this sort of highfalutin stuff about permanence, and then you figure out eventually that you're reading stuff that's been assembled by a paper manufacturer who is pushing his own brand of permanent paper. Quite interesting. But they're claiming that in order to have printed books mean anything for people, we have to make them good to feel and touch and see, and that therefore there's a whole level of sort of junk that will be disappearing. From those who like their e-readers, which are, one correspondent reminded me, also objects, despite people's tendencies to think of them as superseding materiality, come the praises of their ability to store huge amounts of reading material in a small, light, portable package. Responses of this nature come up in two contexts. Often people have been won over to e-readers as travel accessories. I saw my first Kindle, in fact, when Rice's President Lebron showed it off at a faculty reception, saying with some glee that he could take the entire opus of Thackeray along with him on his next trip. Similarly, one parent said that she bought a Kindle as a substitute for the extra suitcase she had to pack for her book-loving son on their family vacation, much to her husband's irritation. She sort of had to smuggle that suitcase past him in order to get it on the plane. Not only did her son love it, but she discovered that they could download books from Amazon anywhere. In this case, Finland was where they were getting onto the WhisperNet, meaning that they would never have to trudge around foreign capitals in search of English bookstores. And in fact, one thing that amazes me as a Kindle user is Amazon's capacity to get you a book anywhere that you are, even if none of your other electronic devices work. You just try it sometime. Go someplace where your cell phone doesn't work and buy a book for your Kindle, and it will appear magically on your screen. So I wonder to myself, what are these people using? Is it high-octane digitization or what? It's totally amazing. A corollary to this is that many readers mentioned the pleasure of being able to download a book immediately. So instant gratification is one of the things that the Kindle offers its users, that is, if they choose the kind of books that are on the Kindle. So there's a sort of accompanying frustration if you can't get the book you want because it hasn't appeared in that format yet. But people love the fact that if they are sort of browsing the bookstore, they can actually get it without even having to go outside of their house. The second context that generates praise of the e-reader as storage object is when people talk about running out of space on their bookshelves. In regard to this, people speak from a place of being crowded out or overwhelmed by their legions of books. The e-reader represents an elegant solution that summons up a vision of the simple life, so no longer being awash in too many objects. Even more elegant is the notion that the material from the e-reader can be stored not in some commercial space, i.e. Amazon, but in the cloud, amenable to retrieval anywhere, anytime. One book club member said that she had accidentally discovered that she had stored her books on the cloud. As she spoke, her tone conveyed a sense of wonder at the kind of complex, technically driven world of information waiting somewhere out there to be accessed almost miraculously through these small devices that she could hold in her hand. Compared to this, a printed book seems both pedestrian and somehow comforting, an object with reassuring heft and stability. This makes it hard to remember that print culture, too, rests on a complex technology of both storage and retrieval, which we have been hearing about today as well. Bookshelf space often privileges legitimate literature over lesser genres. Good books are in display in the front regions of many homes, while mystery, science fiction, and especially pornography are sentenced to back corners, stuffed away out of sight. Thinking of this distinction, one publisher I corresponded with as part of this opined that certain genres might migrate to e-readers more easily than others, and when pressed, referred to romances. Storing romances on an e-reader, he said, solves two problems at once. It handles the issue of volume, and romance readers, in fact, top the charts in terms of numbers of books that they read. And it also deals with the stigmatized nature of romance reading. In place of the bodice ripper book jacket, the readers often conceal with a leather cover. One has the non-committal sleekness of the Kindle that gives absolutely nothing away. If storage in the cloud sounds romantically ethereal, there's another usage of and romance with the printed book that flies in the face of simplicity. Many book people love being literally surrounded by books, books in piles, books on every surface, as a way of grounding their identity while conversingly giving them the wings on which to take flight into an expansive universe of words. As one such woman said, "I have baskets full of books that I'm waiting to read, books on the shelves, books on my bedside table. Another person reflecting on the way piles of books represent for him an inviting amplitude of potential reading experiences said, "From all of those books, I get to pick just the right book for just the right time." For them, an e-reader represents impoverishments. And impoverishment, they're huge stores of books, a storehouse also of possibilities. The physical book can also represent the memory of a beloved reading experience. One reader said that when she is done with a book that she has loved to read, she leaves it out around the house for a while so she can remember it. In much the same way, I treasure books from my own past because they're a bridge to that prior self. From the Oz books whose illustrations I colored first with wild stripes, then with accomplished artistry, each Ozma with blonde, red, or black hair, because I could not stand my own in-between brown, from those books I can conjure forth a vision of who I was when I first read them. Looking at those books brings me back to my childhood neighborhood, our attempts to make actual hollyhocks into the kind of hair decorations Ozma sported, and my own intense attempts to make a stalk of wild grass do the work of a wand. As Godin says, books are a souvenir of the way we felt when we read something. And it is hard to imagine the clean surface of my Kindle instigating that same kind of memory work. Yet other people remark on the signature statement a bookshelf makes about the self. One said, "The books on the bookshelf define who I am." And members of another group I interviewed mentioned the same phenomenon from the vantage point of someone trying to read another person's identity. They asked, how can we tell who people are if we can't look at their bookshelves? This comment, which is kind of remarkable for the assumption that everybody in their circles would have the books to craft and represent their identities, was coupled with their other complaint about e-readers, the difficulty of lending them. Both of these dimensions refer to the social aspect of books, or how they participate in and shape human interaction. One analyst of the book E-Reader Divide, provost and classical scholar James J. O'Donnell, claims we need libraries because books talk among themselves, and in libraries, we can participate in those convocations of books. The respondents I spoke to mostly valued libraries and the informal lending of books because of the conversations they enabled through books among people, which is a sort of layperson's rendition of why cultural circulation is important. In fact, lending books on e-readers, at least at the moment, is quite a problem, unless one lends the actual e-reader itself for a time, which people do. The Nook permits lending a book to one other person for 2 weeks, and I hope I'm right about that at this point, but that's my most current information. But think of the complex loops and promenades executed by the books we love and share, how they expand both our tools for thinking and enrich our communities for more deeply experiencing the world and our own inner lives. Intellectual property discourse and the rules for sharing books digitally have yet to satisfactorily encompass this function of printed books, which is in their case so very, very easy. All you do is take the object and give it to somebody else. And if you're clever, you put your name in it and you write it down on a list somewhere so that they don't totally disappear. On the other hand, if you could share books digitally, they would not come back to you partially eaten by your friend's dog, which happened to one of my very beloved books, or get destroyed by floods from Hurricane Allison, or just never come back to you at all. Before leaving the book as object and vehicle of cultural conversation, a brief coda on the signing of books. This is not something I would think of, but several readers mentioned that one problem of digitized books was that their authors could not sign them. I see others have thought of this. One woman reported that her daughter, who works at Amazon and does most of her reading on the Kindle, always buys real books if she's going to an author's reading and signing event. Another mentioned a copy of a Saul Bellow novel that she had had signed in college, which is now worth, she discovered online, $3,500, which is pretty good. Certainly there's still a realm of embodied charisma and cash value in the author's signature, a realm of magic related to the cultural persona of the creative authorial genius that cannot, at least at this point, make the transition to the digital format. And they may figure out a way to solve that one, but so far, people who want their books signed by the author and have a notion of what an author is and why it's worthwhile to have that author sign that book, and those people, I would imagine include many of you in this room, cannot do that on an e-reader. So the issue of whether problems with e-readers are purely technical and so part of the development of this reading platform, or also cultural or philosophical, is something that comes up a lot when readers consider their books and e-devices in terms of reading. So let me move into a sort of more focused discussion on reading itself. So here the question is, ways of reading, does format matter? And if so, how and how much? And people have different answers to this. When you ask people about differences in reading on their e-readers versus their books, the conversation gets very concrete very quickly. It usually begins with a consideration of the ways that e-readers are more difficult or less satisfying than printed books. Here are the areas of difficulty most often mentioned: flipping back and forth, writing in margins, including taking notes. Yes, you can take notes, but many people find that non-tactile and somehow ephemeral process much less satisfying than writing in their books. And only really good users are able to take notes and then rework them, often in Word documents, so that they can rifle through them and extract the useful bits. So note-taking is really an arduous process. As one person said, 3x5 index cards, which I think Robert Darnton mentioned this morning, are actually a lot easier for that purpose than the e-readers at this point. Viewing maps, photographs, or other illustrations, also very difficult in an e-reader, and the Kindle screen in particular is so small that it's really hard to get a map in a regular-sized book to the point where you can actually read it on your Kindle, even if you expand it as much as possible. Very, very difficult. and more difficult when combined with the desire to do some of the aforementioned flipping back and forth with the text so that you can refer to the map and the text kind of quickly, see how they inform each other. Another thing that bothers a lot of people is figuring out how much more remains in a chapter before it's done. I know, it sounds trivial, but if you're reading late at night especially, it matters whether there are 10 pages left or 2. I mean, it's really important, and those stupid little percentages and figures make absolutely no sense. So you have to kind of go flip, 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 and then back. And it's really kind of irritating. To which I would also add the personal note of it's difficult to go to the end of the book, figure out where to get in the end of the book-ish area, and reading it before you get there, honestly, page by page. And I do that for a variety of reasons. If a book is bad, I'll read the end because I really actually don't want to read the whole middle. If a book is too tense, I'll read the end because I can't bear to wait to figure out how it gets resolved, so I have to see that first. So, but this is something that's never mentioned in the literature, I think because reading the end first, is a form of bad reading behavior that, like reading pornography, seems never to get mentioned in these discussions, but is really common nonetheless. Some of these concerns seem amenable to technical solutions, and people are even now working on eliminating many of the glitches that irritate people about the e-readers. Flipping, for instance, should, it seems to me, not be too demanding a problem to solve. I'm not sure why they haven't solved it yet, but nonetheless. Others may prove to be more obdurate. It's really hard to know at this stage, and especially if you're somebody like me who's not a computer scientist and doesn't really understand what problems are difficult and what problems are easy. Provost O'Donnell says, after a discussion about the difficulties of finding the editions that he wants of classical manuscripts, or even an unabridged edition of The Count of Monte Cristo, his favorite book, that the e-readers don't have the meta-information, which you mentioned, of scholarly classification and evaluation, and so are not friendly to complex documents. Indeed, at the moment, it's impossible to cite, at least I haven't figured out a way to cite an e-book, because there aren't really page numbers, just those irritating little ranges at the bottoms of the page. Instead, O'Donnell claims ebooks have sacrificed some useful aspects of the printed codex book and resemble more than anything the very linear papyrus scroll in that you have to click, click, click forward and then click, click, click back, with the added disadvantage that every book on an e-reader feels and looks the same. He then accuses Amazon's marketer of the Kindle, Mr. Bezos, of not really liking reading and discusses e-readers as pandering to the lowest common denominator of readers and reading practices. Mr. Bezos' feeling about reading aside, and it sounds to me as if they may be rather simplistic, I tend to think of these issues in digitization as roughly parallel to what's been happening in music. The first thing to go digital was popular music, notably songs. For a long time, it was hard to find classical music, especially long works like string quartets or symphonies, at all. And then there were elaborate protocols about how to transfer classical pieces to the iTunes MP3 formats without losing nuance. This was a lesson to me about the relative weight of legitimate or canonized music in the marketplace. And I think that that's probably some of what's going on in this case. Popular books, popular genres are moving quickly, and people like Google, who don't understand the sort of scholarly protocols about how to digitize more complex documents, are just putting stuff online. But it makes sense to me that this process is sort of driven by demand, which means volume to translate, which translates on the whole to what is popular. And I guess I'm, in that sense, less worried about the format switch than Professor O'Donnell, because I feel that scholars will start corralling things and making sense out of editions and trying to bring some order to the chaos of the way it's been going now. I'm going to skip a little bit because I'm almost done, but I do want to say this. I've heard several very moving accounts of people who've been only able to read through these platforms. One was a respondent's dyslexic son who has been using the audio voice function on his Kindle to read books. And that process has been enabling him to figure out printed text more easily. So another was a quite obviously quite educated respondent, a PhD in literature, who's been suffering from a degenerative nerve disease for some years. Her attention span is not long, and her hands are affected by a tremor. So at first she read on her iPhone, and she found that she was able to hold it. Now she likes her Kindle. It's still something that she can hold, but it gives her a little bit of text, and she's able to manage. Her attention span is long enough to get what's in the screen. So for her, it opens up the world of reading. They may be outliers in the reading universe. Most of us don't have those problems, but I want to get to my final point through them, which is, to me, what matters mostly. Of course, I study reading, so this would be the case. What matters most is not the future of books so much as the future of reading. And book readers are curiously pragmatic about the issue of format on the whole, willing to swing either way so long as they can just keep on reading. Very few of the book readers I interviewed, however, thought that books would ever disappear because of the very reasons that keep them so attached to books as objects that bring sensual pleasures, including the pleasures of commentary and memory, as well as a certain social and cultural aura. It's very odd that Walter Benjamin's notion of aura, which he defines as a sort of singularity of handmade objects related to sort of sacred culture, seems to have been absorbed by books, which are, after all, mass-produced. But nonetheless, to book readers, they have some of that aura, I think. So the concerns that readers tend to have about the e-world is that its pace and staccato quality may make reading itself difficult for the younger generation. As one woman said, "Now it's all zap, zap, zap. It's hard to get in the rhythm of reading something cover to cover." Analysts such as Marianne Wolf and Nicholas Carr have expressed worry that indeed the pressure towards a life of constant rapid-paced connectivity may be eroding people's ability to enjoy deep reading and may take away that sort of creative, empty, private space, or at least solitary space, that's necessary for a reflective inner life. That troubles me as well, although I don't think that pressure on us comes just from the digital world, but from many other aspects of our culture. But in counterposition to that concern, let me strike a more positive note at the end, involving writing as well as reading. The world may indeed change for both writing and reading, but we haven't yet seen the end of invention of new forms of writing and communication that the digital world has begun to open up for us. If the move to the printed book opened up new vistas of literacy and imaginative invention, and maybe spread the possibilities for that kind of invention more broadly, then it's at least possible that will also it's at least something we can hope for, that will also be true of this age as well. And let me end at that moment and hope that we get some good questions. Thank you.
Paul and Elizabeth, thank you both very much for two both thought-provoking and extremely comforting presentations. Usually I like to go to conferences and be shaken up. Today I'm deeply gratified to have been taken on a tour d'horizon of an area of which I know very little, but have come back somewhere where I feel extremely comfortable. And one of the issues I think that has been very central is to this panel and panel's discussion is how much materiality matters. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that the discussion around ebooks has, in a way, retroactively opened up a huge area about the book as an affective and mnemonic an object. And also the fact that you have, in a way, liberated us, or some of us, in ways that we did not expect to be outed or liberated here, because you have, in a way, allowed us actually to confront our own erotic practices when reading books. The smell of the book, the feel of the book, nibbling the pages of the book in private. I mean, this has been a very liberating experience for me, at least. Now, I just wanted to add one other text, or one other, for me, great landmark in this discussion. Elizabeth, you almost got there when you talked about the notion of aura in Benjamin, but I was thinking of that great text on unpacking my library. Yes. Benjamin's great text on unpacking his library, where unpacking the library is an itinerary of a life. Mm-hmm. It brings back all the places he's been to. Mm-hmm. With the ebook, it seems, you can be anywhere, and what you keep wondering at is that the book appears at that place. Mm-hmm. You don't talk about the place as much as you talk about the appearance of the book. Whereas in the other case, the book brings back a life, brings back a moment. And I wondered how, in fact, this whole idea, the emphasis on storage and retrieval, storage and quicker retrieval, and even quicker retrieval, depletes us of that other material narrative of the book, the way in which the book creates the world, or the book adds to the world, or the book reminds you of the world in which you read it. And I think there is something here about the emphasis on retrieval, which is obviously hugely exciting to have a book, not to carry, as I do, a book bag of 60 books or 70 books with me every summer when I leave the US. It's wonderful to have these on the Kindle, but it doesn't allow you to have, with your books, to have that same kind of intimacy. The other issue, of course, you mentioned or skirted around, both of you talked about narratives of the Darwinian narrative, and so on, and you talked about the material, the nostalgia of the book. But it seems to me that if we're talking about books, materiality, and intimacy, then light must be important. What does it mean to have a backlit screen? And how does that actually create or not create forms of identification and alienation. What does it mean to have a screen lit at the back rather than the kind of environmental, the lighting that we have, the atmospheric lighting that you have normally in reading books? I'm suggesting that these are different ways about thinking about the question of identification, and as you brought it up. But thank you both. Other than that, I think we should turn to the audience and to their questions. We have a few here. I'm actually going to, some of them are addressed to one or other of you, but I think I might just, oh gosh, we do have a lot. I'll have to read extremely fast here. But I have read some of them. Let me start with one that I thought had all the particular interests of a manuscript, in fact, because the question goes, and it's Paul to you, but I think if both of you want to take it up, please feel free. It says most of your objections to Google Books are technology limitations of converting paper. As we move forward, something digital books will have better representations. Born digital books will have better representations, won't they? Now, I say it has all the interests of a manuscript and manuscript erasures, because it says most of your objections, and above it says cheap shots. Cancelled out. Now here you see, if I hadn't done an Oxford B-Lit where they took you to the library and taught you to read manuscripts, I might as well have missed this. Most of your cheap shots erased objections. Right.
In comparison to Google, we all seem cheap, I suppose. Cheap shots, they may be. I think two things. One is, as I tried to say at the beginning, this is not simply a nostalgia for the old book. My point of taking cheap or otherwise shots at Google was to say, as I profoundly believe from many encounters with people from Google Books, is that they have a very naive understanding of the book, and that actually does play itself across a large area of people who are designing technology for books. And they're not going to design very good future technology, I think, if they don't understand the past better. Not that they have to replicate the past, only that they really have to understand in many ways how we got the Codex book to work. I think that if the core understanding is that a text is platform independent and simply migrates from one reader to another, they're missing a great deal about how the text works, because text seems to me to be remarkably unstable stuff, and pinning it down and making it usefully communicative and understanding intention is a tricky task, and it's worth understanding how we've done that in the past, not simply to replicate it. Though with something like Google Books, when you are taking a large number of libraries, books, and time and effort and digitizing them, you might make a better effort with those. But also to understand, I think, where we can go needs understanding how communication works a little better, cheap or otherwise.
Well, I guess I don't feel like I was taking cheap shots in that.
No, actually,
I think it was me. I was taking the cheap shot.
Yeah.
But
you don't have to deal with the cheap shots, with the question.
But I feel, I think you're right. And I think that's one reason that digital humanities are so important, actually, whether as a discipline or as an embedded part of many disciplines, because I think that digital humanities people offer a very informed bridge into the world of digital life from a position of sophisticated understanding of what's gone before, and can often translate for people on either side of the divide. So, yay, digital humanities.
Actually, the materiality of reading and the materiality of books really does seem to be the theme of these questions. Let me try you with something about materiality and architecture. The places where we store books, libraries, form natural and productive spaces in which to read. Again, important to read carefully, ... in which we read ... Then, in a potential future of e-books and e-readers, what happens to these spaces? Do we lose them? Do they change? What would the loss or change of such spaces do to reading and consequently to the future of books or to future books?
Well, I'm going to answer from one of the book groups. I didn't put it in the paper, but one of the members of one of the book groups I talked to said that a reason that she kept buying books was because she wanted to support independent booksellers. And she actually had, at this point, this is Houston, she was going back to an independent bookstore in Michigan and one in California, so to keep supporting them. And she felt that buying books as books, unless ebooks could figure out a way of going through booksellers, was really crucial, because those spaces were spaces where book lovers congregated. They were social spaces. They were spaces that nurtured the habit of reading. One of the other members of the book group said, of course you realize they'll all be dead in a few years, and seemed not to be terribly worried about this future. But people then spent some time talking about reading spaces as really important for nurturing the life of the mind, partly because of the conversations that happen not just between readers and books or books and books, but also between readers and readers. So it's...
I think that the place of books, or the space of books as a social space, is enormously significant. I think Elizabeth West is enormously interesting, I think, because indeed of the rise of the book club. There's places where people do want to come together to read books, and they have Twitter and they have blogs, and they're not necessarily unsophisticated and can use them, but they still find something about coming books. So that there's the book club. There's the bookshop. I'm not an academic. While everyone's getting PhDs, I ran a bookshop in London. It's now out of business. I'm sad it's gone. It was, I think, a remarkable place for bringing people together, and for people to be able to do that wonderful serendipitous thing of finding books that they didn't know about and finding other readers that they know about. And I think actually that in England there has been a sort of crisis of books have gone out, and now the crisis has been helped a little by some of the major chains going out of business. It's reached a moderately stable level of a certain number of small bookshops, which I think are very interesting and influential centers in some ways. And finally, to the library, I have been intrigued as one of these cases when we see a move to a new world and the old guard howl miserably. I lived on both sides of the move of the British Library, from the old round reading room. And poor old Norman St. John, I think it was, who designed the new library, was more or less ostracized. He had a huge practice. He designed the British Library. He has ended up, I think, with a single desk in the corner of his wife's larger office doing sort of bathroom remodels. Because he was vilified beyond all belief, because Marx sat in this seat, how could you move those books? If you go to the British Library, people love it. It's enormously highly used. People only complain about how many people are there because it's so actively used. It's an extraordinarily social presence as well as a place that you can go to read books. It has had to change in interesting ways from what they envisaged, how they envisaged the space would be used. But it, in fact, is a remarkable, it seems to me, vindication that libraries don't have to be these old ancient structures, that they do have a future, and in all these different places, the social space of books remains remarkably important while we continue to read individually and online.
Well, may I just say something there? I used to sit at that desk, which was supposed to be Marx's desk, 07, you know. I used to try and get there in the round reading room. But I do think that one of the reasons that he was so vilified was that it took them 10 years to raise the money to build the building, didn't it? And by the time it was set up, I actually think it's a kind of rather a handsome, brutal building. But a lot of people found it architecturally also out of shape. So it was not simply that Marx, there was a certain element of that, of the displacement. But I think his architectural practice shrunk because it was quite out of step and out of time, and it was not his fault. And then he got beaten over the head like they do in Britain all the time,
Right.
because of something he couldn't himself help.
Well, some of you may know that you come in now and sort of in a recollection of the Dartmouth Library, that huge the King George collection is there. That space was in fact built for the card catalogue, which tells you how long it took for that to come into being.
That's right.
So I want to say something about cafes, because I think cafes are also interesting spaces for reading. We had a building built at Rice, donated by an architect, and it was supposed to be a place that brought people together who weren't. It was trying to get a place for faculty, graduate students, and undergraduates to all come together in a sort of relatively elegant and pretty setting to have important discussions. That was the idea, and when we interviewed potential users about the building, one of the things that people were very concerned about was that there be enough outlets for people's laptops. We reported that back to the president, who was very involved in this project, and he said, I don't want people, that's such a nerdy thing. Everybody just spending all their time on their laptops. But in fact, that's what people do in cafes now. I mean, that laptops are part of the cafe scene, and it doesn't seem to have killed the cafe scene. And those very people who are on their laptops also appear to have relationships with other people in the cafe. So,
while having relationships with their laptop.
Also relationships with their laptop. Yeah.
Well, now this is a good one. Today, nobody has mentioned the haptic qualities of the book, how the movement of the hands informs the reading process. Do you have any comments on that? I think we're going to talk about the materiality of the book, then this whole haptics is quite important.
Well, yes. I mean, I think it is one of the material aspects that authors have used for years. I mean, Jane Austen talks about it in Northanger Abbey, about the number of pages in your right hand tell you that the end of the book is coming. And there are kind of two ploys in a way. One is that you suddenly feel, often with Dickens, how on earth is he going to wrap all this up in that number of pages? The other is, late at night, do I have to go through all this because I can see where this is going? But the second one is one that authors, I think, play with deliberately, and you can see how it shifts. I mean, with the short story, you get this sense that if you're reading a short story and it's like, bang, you're suddenly at the end and you didn't know it was coming. Again, the materiality affects that, and I think authors know how to play with that and have, and it doesn't replicate. Stern, has this nice thing about, if you knew what was coming on the next page, you would tear it out. And in fact, it's the last page of the volume, so he sort of knows that's... And so they've done it all along, but I think it's a very useful part of the communicative medium.
Well, this is an interesting angle on the matter, on the importance of material. If material matters, could Professor Duguid comment on the draft accreditation standards for law school libraries, which suggest that the library could be all book or all electronic?
I could comment. I wrote an essay a long time ago for First Monday about law libraries, so I'm just trying to see now if I can remember what I said. I think that law libraries are an odd kind of library because the law school profession and business school libraries, to a certain extent, have a very strong social enculturation process, which doesn't necessarily involve the materials in that way. So in fact, when we heard this morning, I hate to sound skeptical that the law library here was full. I had a feeling it was probably for the online devices that people were mostly there for, or somewhere to go between classes. Because I think that the nature of the law book, and I now work a lot with law books, in fact, the physicality of the book is not all that important. And they have been the first of the great builders, well, maybe I shouldn't say that in front of that, of builders of reference books on a sort of a huge scale, because they really had such a stable system of the law, even though they often think it isn't, that they can kind of pull all this stuff out and disembody it. I don't think that works across the humanities in general, or across less highly socially structured communicative systems.
Finally, and I think we need a few moments between panels, so how do children's books fit into this discussion?
Wow. I speak now as a grandmother. And as a grandmother, I can say that there are a lot of electronic devices around, sort of digital, but the children's books are still the primary medium that I've used with grandchildren. And I don't know how that's going to work out over time, because there's this surge of invention of sort of games and puzzles that you can do on screens, and presumably those are extremely interesting to kids. But my grandchildren are not old enough for me to really know about that yet, so I'll get back to you. But I don't have any professional opinion about that.
Do ebooks create an environment in which children learn to read earlier or sooner? Does it integrate more with games and with particular kinds of visual practices?
I don't know.
Well, thank you both very much. I apologize to those of you
We
for
can
not
carry
being able
that
to...
theme out into the reception, I think.
Sorry for those of you I wasn't able to represent your questions, but I'm sure the speakers will take them up in the coffee break. Thank you.
Okay, we're going straight on.
Okay. No coffee break. Catch the speakers later.
My name is Charles Rosenberg, and it's I don't want to repeat all the thanks to the wonderful people at Radcliffe who've arranged this very stimulating meeting. And I think all of us who've been here since 9 o'clock feel that we've learned a lot and had to think a lot. And I want to say one or two words, and then I'll introduce our rapper-upper, Peter Stallybrass. First is that I'm very much aware that there is a kind of sense of crisis, or at least that people feel we're at a moment or a kind of ambient change that's fundamental but hard to pin down. And at first I thought there was a kind of utopian, dystopian structure to this, on the kind of utopian notion of a accessible, democratic universe of data that will make everything better somehow, and then a dystopian other side of where privacy is compromised, and one has a kind of modern anomie of abundant oceans of data that are unstructured, changing, and create a kind of depersonalized modern self. I'll stop that. But it seems to me the bottom line, as I was listening to this, is that it's not that the book is going to die, but that the book has a particular kind of life that brought so many registrants here that the people at Radcliffe were astonished at the response. So the real question is not whether the book is moribund or in intensive care, but its relationship to everything else, and what that configuration is between the book and everything else. And so the issue to me is continuity and change, and how it exists at different levels. And I was reminded by one of the earlier speakers that we're in what had been a women's gymnasium, which of course was itself a sign of change, both material and cultural. And then we went through we performed a ritual of academic activity in which talks were given, papers were read, heads nodded, and yet at the same time, it was very different because there was twittering. It will be archived tomorrow, and we'll have created a text of a sort that is new and different, and there it is, whatever we want to call it, which is a wonderful way for me, at least, to introduce Peter Stallybrass, because Peter was a longtime friend and colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, and Peter had a real influence on me because he made me think about the history of the book in a different way. The history of the book seminar at Penn is now history of material texts, and he made me think that history of the book was not just a ghetto at one level for bibliographers and book dealers and literary historians, but that it was a vital part of a very complicated world, of a process of the transmission of cultural information with inscription, storage, and deciphering. and that there are lots of ways and technologies, lots of contexts in which this process took place. And the strength of that approach is that it makes you reconfigure things in different ways. And it also makes the history of the book part of history generally in a way that it had not been. And that's as much as I really wanted to say, because I don't want to take time away from Peter, who has the job of wrapping up.
So you'd be very pleased to know this is the shortest session. I got a very stern message. It said, 10 to 15 minutes maximum, and no discussion afterwards. I was just told that. So what it says on the program about discussion, forget it. You get your drink, so you'll be much happier that way. You've had plenty of time for discussions. You'll be able to put notes in and so on. But not now. What I'm going to do, rather than sort of name names, I'm going to pick up some of the topics I think that ran through, they're really just spectacular, really spectacular papers. I think it's been a spectacular conference. And one of the things that's been most pleasing about it, to me, most exciting about it, is the way in which, as Charles said, those sort of expected oppositions, are you on the side of the new or the old, really don't come up. I mean, you think of someone like Matt, who actually does hand printing. He doesn't tell you that, but he does. He's a hand printer, amongst other things. So, he's lived across many, many different cultural formations, even though he's an expert on hard drives and computer software and so on. So the first, just to go back right to this morning, though, and start where we started with Bob and Stuart, why books? And behind that, obviously, was the question, will the book, as we have known it, at least in the West, for 2 millennia, survive the new technologies. And the first thing to say, which, this is perfectly commonplace by now, is that technologies don't necessarily just displace each other. In other words, one shouldn't look at just single technologies. Nearly always technologies interact with other technologies. So what's up on the screen is an example of a breviary used in the Catholic Church. This is at Smith College. It was written originally about 1500. What you can see is it was used continuously for 300 years, being constantly updated. They add printed texts, so you can see the printed texts. These printed texts are, by the way, actually cut out of so they were destroying books, I should say, to bring this up to date. But it also includes in it, and something I'll come back to, it has got what I'd call job printed prayers. They actually printed prayers specifically to update your breviary with the latest saints and so on, so as a new saint was canonized. But what you've got then is something that already you can see that different technologies come together. And what I want to stress is that, in one sense, of course you could say that printed books displaced an earlier technology, manuscripts. If what you meant by that very few people in 1800 were writing Bibles, although there were people in 1800 writing Bibles, but they were a small group, certainly not on the scale that they'd been written in 13th century Paris. But on the other hand, I think the word manuscript itself has hidden from us something that should have been obvious all along. I mean, most of the debate about these competing technologies, these earlier competing technologies, has assumed that, it's a useful term, manuscript. I actually have always thought we should abolish the word manuscript. Manuscript is a print culture term. It's first used in English in 1590s. So, as long as you're writing by hand, you're writing. You're not writing by hand. I mean, you're not writing with your mouth, you're not writing with your foot, you're just writing. And if you just say writing, then it's completely clear that one of the major effects of printing is a writing revolution. In other words, printing massively interacted with writing, so that now if you fly into the United States, you have to fill in, by law, a customs declaration form. That customs declaration form is printed, and you have to fill it in. So you've got compulsory literacy behind, but you've got writing on a scale that's never existed in the Middle Ages. So writing is everywhere. And one of the things I want to think about is the way in which computers have actually stimulated writing to an extraordinary degree. I'm a very bad writer, probably my most notorious trait is I scarcely do email. I try to avoid it as much as possible, but because I like to read. And it seems to me that, one of the things, I actually feel threatened by the demand for so much writing today, so I think this notion, one of the things you see, but I do like note-taking, a very particular kind of writing, I guess. So one thing I want to say is that technologies don't just simply displace each other. They may do over time, but we need to actually think how they articulate with each other. And I think that's a much more important task, to see how many of us have Kindles. I have a Kindle, but I also read books. I don't see them as competing. I see them as useful for different activities. They'll change, and I'm sure we'll think differently about it in the future. Another example of a bad opposition is the notion of orality versus literacy and written script cultures, as if what we're doing today isn't lectures. And lecture is such a bizarre word because it means reading, right? So a lecture is somebody who speaks, but the actual word from the French means a reading. So it's a double activity. We're always involved in these overlapping activities. One question that perhaps didn't come up, and I think, one aspect of it came up, but perhaps not one other aspect didn't come up, is why books ever? It's not as if books necessarily have important places in every society. And that is partly for material reasons and partly for cultural reasons. Just to give one example, we know a huge amount, of course, about North Africa, because North Africa turns out to be an ideal climate. There's an ecology to the book for clay tablets, for preserving papyrus, for huge ranges of things. But that's not true of Southeast Asia. So if you go and look at Sanskrit culture, written on palm leaves, their survival rate is brutal. They don't survive very well. And not only that, but it's not been, in my view, really central. So my colleague Justin McDaniel, who's written a wonderful book, he's a Sanskritist, called Gathering Leaves and Lifting Words. He went to study this culture, became a Buddhist monk, and what he learned was he kept asking to see their books. It's a highly literate culture. They said, well, we have got them, but he couldn't see them. And it turned out why he couldn't see them, they'd lost the key. They'd actually literally locked them away in this thing. But that wasn't how they transmitted their text. They did not transmit them by reading. They transmitted it by very, very elaborate memory systems. And it makes me very skeptical of much of the work that's been done on memory, as if we know what memory is when we're not dealing with people with very highly trained memories. These are people who learn their text forwards, then backwards, then first, third, fifth, seventh, ninth word, then first, fifth, 10th, 15th word. The point is to exactly get those words in place. This is a highly material practice. That's what I want to emphasize. This isn't an abstract text. It couldn't be more material. It's not to interpret the text. It's to make sure that the text is preserved and transmitted exactly. It's a totally different kind of cultural formation. But the book is there. It's important. They value their books, they preserve them as best they can, although it's very difficult to preserve with termites and God knows what. But nonetheless, that's not really how they're transmitted. It's transmitted through these other systems. Does format matter? It certainly does, and this is one of the questions that came up, and I think repeatedly came up. One of the things that I think one might want to think about in relationship to Elizabeth's readers is that, in that wonderful account she gave, that's very much one kind of reading. One of the things that's happened when people say, do people read anymore, they're nearly always talking about novels. They're thinking about novels. And novels have always been the most bizarre and perverse form of reading. It should be emphasized that, from my perspective, the whole history of the book is in relationship to an alternative technology that it partly displaces, which is the scroll. So, if you think about what's happening, if you think of a Torah scroll, and a Torah scroll you read continuously. You read through the whole year, the Pentateuch, beginning to end. What the book made possible, whether it was intentional or not, was for a quite different kind of reading practice. That some of the earliest reading practices we know about with Christians was what they did was not to read in that sense at all. They collated the four Gospels with each other with canon tables. In other words, you're not reading in the ordinary sense. You're actually seeing how does John compare to? It's an indexical system. It bears no relationship to novel reading. So one of the interesting things is to say, for me, novel reading is the most perverse, I mean that positively, I love novel reading, but the most perverse use you can make of a book. To read page 1, page 2, page 3, page 4, it's fabulous, but it's not what books are particularly good for. That's why the cinema is so fabulous. You go back to a scroll format when I was a kid, you'd go and you'd see the reel at school, turning round, and you're going round and round. They would break, of course, and you total suspense, but that's a scroll format. So one of the things I think the format matters, and one of the things that came up repeatedly was the notion of storage, how we store. But it should be emphasized, and I think Adrian pointed to this, as did Matt, that storage is undoubtedly changing, how we store text, what it means to store text. But again, one thing should be remembered is that the book, in a way, has always marginalized other technologies, so that when we store books, we're not storing text. They're not the same thing at all. Libraries are very, very well made for storing books. They're not well made for storing broadsides. They're not well made for storing a huge range, so that the library shelves are actually related to a very specific format. In 1907, they had a survey in England, and that only 13% of printed sheets are used for books. 13%. So that 87% of printed sheets are for other things. They're for jam jar labels, they're for, you mentioned it, they're for the reserved on the back of seats, or 1,001 things. Newspapers, but not things. And so one of the things is that these are not, by and large, destined for survival. They're not destined, they're ephemera. And that's a problem, because if you actually want to understand the history of printing, those are the things you need to really understand. You need to understand how books, a rather expensive and specialized form, fits into this history of a much, much wider range of forms. And that came up in the most interesting ways, I thought, with Isabel's talk on Gandhi's Indian Home Rule. There's a wonderful example. It's a pamphlet. And it's a pamphlet that none of the major libraries have. Why don't they have it? Because it's a pamphlet. I mean, if it had been a book, if it had been actually in a book format, if it was, in other words, a lot longer, that would be the first thing. If it was 500 pages, its survival chances would have been infinitely higher. So there are other reasons, too, I'm sure, why it didn't survive. The same with Meredith. You think that the newspaper, those are the things that are not likely to survive. Once you actually get printed in book format, your chances of survival massively increase. So that, I mean, one of the things, I think, one of the pressures upon libraries, and it's libraries really, I think, that we all need to also think about intensely. These are the places where the pressures are felt most intensely of storage space at the very time when what's being asked of libraries is to do more collecting, to collect a wider range of objects, to collect more ephemera. The Library Company in Philadelphia has this huge collection that Michael Zinman built up of early American ephemera. Most of these are unique, well, I don't know if most are, Jim, or most unique copies, probably most are unique copies, right? They're unique copies because, so compared to the Gutenberg Bible, which lots and lots of copies, the first folio, the Folger Shakespeare Library has 80 first folios. So there, the knowledge survival rate has been very, very low. As Keith Richards reprehensibly put it in one of his songs, "Who wants yesterday's paper?" Well, not "Who wants yesterday's girl?" But of course, we should be celebrating Keith Richards because we now know that if he hadn't been a rock star, he wanted to be a librarian. It's true. That's true. I've not made that up. His autobiography is out. It's out there, and he also turns out to be a great collector of antiquarian books. He's an antiquarian book collector. So, in amongst his massive drug ingestion, he was doing, he was supporting our business. So we have a lot of reason to be grateful to Keith Richards. But one of the things I did yesterday, I went to the conservation lab, and you think there again, you suddenly realize that what actually the question of the future of the book is about, is a range of very, very hugely complicated issues. I watched Pamela repairing an 9th century, I think, 8th or 9th century parchment manuscript, which the reason it's not going to survive is because of the bugs that have been eating it. So it's being eaten by bugs. So but then you look at 19th century French books, 19th century Chinese books, where the high acid content of the paper mean they're literally decaying. You pick them up and they fall apart in your hands. So it's not at all the case that just by being a book. So it turns out, going back to what Elizabeth was saying, paper does matter. It really matters. And when you actually go to these people working on paper conservation, you start to see just how much it matters. So we live in a paper world, but a paper world which depends upon the quality of the paper, how long it's going to last, what will happen to it. But as I said, the library is actually now under pressure to conserve more and more things. If you think about the Library Company, it has actually gone, it narrowed down its brief. That when Franklin was around, it actually collected electricity machines. There were many machines and things in the library. And I would like that. I would actually like libraries, if they could do this, to have more things, to be more like wonder cabinets, so that, and I think that that aspect of sort of hands-on experimentalism would be wonderful if it was possible. Obviously, that's itself utopian. It require more space, more money. But NYU, for instance, is collecting gay culture in the village, and they're collecting lots of stuff which has no relationship to books at all. So it creates these whole new problems of storage. How do you store it? How do you store someone's genes? You know, these are real questions. The Folger collects actors' costumes on a small scale. So it's got 19th century, and they're there sitting underneath the bookshelves in boxes, so you can go through their props and so on. So, you know, I think that the question of books, we need to see them in their interactions and their rich interactions with all of these other forms that are so exciting. So I see the future as being about both understanding the niches that books occupied in the past, the many niches they occupied in the past, as we try to imagine and create new niches for them in the future. And as I say, I think that books have always been a small part. One of Roger Stoddard's most famous statements was, whatever they do, authors don't write books. Whatever they do, authors don't write books. And what he meant something very mundane by it. He meant that the way in which we think about texts and how texts historically been produced, people writing manuscripts and things, but actually books are made objects. They've involved vast ranges of labor. And one of the most fascinating things in the conservation lab, looking at the different kinds of materials, which paper is made out of, cotton, linen, all the different systems. But I thought, for me, one of the things that just was so gripping, they had a great image from a 19th century newspaper of a rag picker, the lowest paid member of society, the poorest members of society. Rag pickers are the people without whom there is no paper. Without no paper, there is no, printing doesn't make any sense. So that books, in that sense, are very extraordinary things because they condense into themselves the labors of just about every group in a society. It's just amazing how many labors they cross. And so the question of what their future is partly they have immense value for me because of that, because of the way in which they have condensed all of those parts. And the last thing, I'll just stop with this. Two more things very quickly. The first is that Isabel absolutely rightly reminded us that publishing and print capitalism are not coterminous. And I'd say they're not even coterminous where she was talking. They're not coterminous anywhere. You think that stereotype is very, very bound up with the trapped societies, with things being given away. So many, to this day, you think of Gideon Bibles. Giving away books is a huge part. Another non-commodity, academic books were always a disaster. It's not new. Cambridge University Press, which actually competed with the Stationers' Company monopoly in London. The Stationers' Company didn't give a damn as long as Cambridge published academic books. No one bought them, they didn't have to worry. Then they said they wanted to publish almanacs. All hell broke loose. Almanacs matter, academic books, well, they didn't worry about those. So we have to think about what people read, how they read, does it matter whether people, sometimes, as we all know, books take time to find the people who want to read them. And that's a very important point about storage. We do need to store as much as we can because we don't know what future generations will ask. I think that's the most important thing of all, that the ephemera that Michael Zinman has collected, no one 100 years ago would have thought that any of that stuff was of any significant interest. It's not. And now, that's what people come to the library company to work on, this invaluable material that makes us see a culture in a totally new way. And finally, this is the final thing. So digitizing. Digitizing at Penn, our rare book librarian came to Penn, first of all, as a digitizer, to be head of digital technology. So he combines two roles, head of digital technology and head of our digitizing program and head of rare books. And it seems to me that, there's always been a sort of completely bizarre notion that digitizing is going to threaten everything. From my perspective, digitizing is not one thing, and that's the first thing to say. It does data gathering, like EBO, but it does the opposite. It does very high-resolution photographs, is what we're doing at Penn. We make publicly accessible to anyone all over the world. All of our manuscripts, up to 1,800, are going to be freely available in very high-resolution photographs. And that's going to be, many of them are up already. Most of them, not most of them, but perhaps 30% or something, 40% are up already. It's called Pen in Hand. Pen in Hand. If you go on the web, you can find, so Pen in Hand. And you can search by language. We've got Sanskrit, we've got French, you mentioned it. You can search by century. You can search by all sorts of things, whether it's got images or not. All of these things you can search. But one of the things about digitizing and why it doesn't, on the one hand, and it's a question that did come up earlier, are the digital images better? And in some ways they are. Let's just say that straight out. In some ways, digital images are better than the objects. This image above, when you're teaching paleography, you want very high resolution digitization that you can magnify. And then what I do is I get students to actually go letter by letter. And when I was trained in paleography, I had to actually cut out from photocopies the individual letters to create the alphabet of the scribe. The A's, the B's, the C's, you paste it in, and you get the alphabet of the scribe. You're obviously not going to do that with the original document. You're not going to go through cutting out the A's, the B's. So, there's a way in which, but with high resolution digital images like this, paleography becomes much, much simpler. And the images are better. I mean, in any obvious way, they're better. What they can't do is we don't know what questions we want to ask of these objects. And the photographs themselves are taken with, in this case, very straightforwardly, if you lift it up, this is a flap on your left, that's a flap. You don't know what's underneath that. If this disappears, you won't be able to read any of what's underneath that. So that would take another photograph. But so it's not that it's the end. We'll keep taking photographs, digital photographs. We're keeping finding new questions that we ask at Penn, which mean we need to take new digital photographs. So it's a paradox. It's the digital photographs, but you need the object to keep going back to. So when you discover that wormholes, one of the most brilliant lectures I've heard this year was by Randy McLeod. It's called How a Worm Reads. And he literally has traced a worm and shown how a worm read in the warehouse. So it shows how books were warehoused in sheets, the way it went through the sheets, which makes no sense because the book's now bound. It's all been folded up. So you think, why did the worm stop there? Well, it didn't. So we need these things, and we need open access. We need open access because for all Paul's reservations, which I totally agree with, and I think that there is a kind of foolish notion of openness in a general sense. What we do need is to resist commercialization and to try to make all that we do, particularly universities, they have an obligation, in my view, to make their stuff openly available. And there's a real advantage to the digital over the book. If you go to Houghton, which I love to do, they close their doors. It's horrendous. Just at the point when you're getting going, they close their doors. They want to go home and have supper and things. And you want to say, I don't want to have supper. I want to read the books. So you need the digital images. So at midnight, at 2 o'clock in the morning, you can be working on the digital images, getting all excited about the fact that, at 9 o'clock in the morning, when their doors open, you're going to go back in. And you're going to touch that thing, you're going to smell it, you're going to actually be working with that object in all the exciting ways. But the images are pretty exciting too. They really are. So that's the last thing to say. I see these two things. I don't see at all the future as being threatened by the digital. As Homi said, reading rooms, are packed. They were never this packed 20 years ago. I hate it. I used to like it 20 years ago. Then you went to these places, you were the only person, you got special treatment. You had secret handshakes, all the rest of it. And now you're just another regular guy, who goes in there and you have to compete with everybody else. And including family, people studying family history who are actually a very, very interesting group of people. And academics need to spend more time learning how they've learned their skills because some of those people, I got stuck in the library company, and literally I couldn't go any further with my research, and 2 family historians, the people I used to turn up my nose at, I have to admit, they gave me the skills to do the research, which they'd learned. They were autodidacts. So autodidacts are also an important group. Thank you.
Well, the formal part of our conference has come to an end, and on behalf of Leah and all those who participated in the planning and organizing of this event, I have to say it far exceeded our wildest hopes. And I have some people to thank whom I haven't thanked before. I think I wanted to see how it worked out, actually. And those are the session chairs, the panelists, and the audience who have come from far and near. Thank you so much. You made this conference, all of you. And I invite you to come now to the reception in the Agassiz building as you go down to the right across the breezeway. Thanks again.